The Simmons family was the epitome of perfection in their suburban neighborhood. John Simmons, a successful businessman, was admired by his colleagues and peers for his hard work and dedication to his company. His wife, Claire, was known for her beauty and grace, always well-dressed and attending social gatherings with a smile on her face. Their 2 children, Emily and Noah, were seen as well-behaved and intelligent, excelling in school and extracurricular activities. From the outside, their family seemed like a model of happiness and success, untouched by the challenges that many others faced. They had a beautiful home, a few luxury cars parked in the driveway, and an image that suggested nothing could ever disrupt their perfect lives. For years, everything had seemed fine. John would come home from work each evening, tired but content, ready to spend time with his family. Claire would prepare dinner, and the family would sit down to eat together, sharing stories about their day. It was a routine they all found comfort in, but slowly, things began to change. John's business had started to demand more of his time, and he found himself working late into the evenings more often than not. Long hours at the office meant fewer family dinners, fewer outings, and less time spent with Claire and the children. He tried to make up for it during the weekends, but the growing pressure at work made him irritable and distracted, leaving him unable to enjoy the family moments that once brought him peace. Claire, who had once been a doting wife and mother, started to feel the absence of her husband. As the weeks passed, she became more withdrawn. She threw herself into her own activities, attending social events with friends, volunteering at the children's school, and focusing on the household. She would tell herself that she understood the demands of John's job, that he was doing it all for the family, but deep down, she couldn't help but feel lonely. She missed the man who used to come home with a smile on his face, eager to spend time with her. Now, he came home exhausted, barely able to keep his eyes open, his thoughts always elsewhere. Emily, who was old enough to understand the subtle changes in her parents' relationship, noticed the distance between them. Her mother's once warm and loving demeanor had begun to feel distant, and John's presence, though physically there, was no longer emotionally available. Emily tried to ignore the growing tension at home, focusing on her studies and her friends, but she couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. Her younger brother Noah was too young to fully grasp the situation, but he often asked why their father seemed so tired or why their mother looked sad sometimes. It broke Emily's heart to see her family unraveling, but she didn't know how to fix it. Then there was Mark, the new manager at John's company. Mark was charismatic and outgoing, and he quickly became a trusted figure in the workplace. John spoke highly of him to Claire, often mentioning how impressive Mark was, and how he had been a great addition to the team. What John didn't know, however, was that Mark had begun to spend more time with Claire outside of work. Initially, it seemed innocent, casual conversations at work events or company gatherings. But as time passed, their interactions began to take a more personal turn. Claire found herself looking forward to their conversations, feeling a connection she hadn't felt in years. Mark's attention was flattering, and he seemed to understand her in a way John no longer did. What started as an innocent friendship slowly evolved into something much deeper, though neither of them had admitted it yet. In the midst of her marriage's growing dysfunction, Claire found solace in these moments with Mark. She began to confide in him, sharing her frustrations about John and the changes in their marriage. Mark listened attentively, offering comfort and understanding. The attention was exactly what Claire had been craving. She didn't know it then, but these small, seemingly harmless moments would eventually lead her down a dark and dangerous path. As time passed, Claire's relationship with Mark began to grow more intense. The small moments of conversation at work turned into long, late-night phone calls, and casual meetings at company events became something more. Mark seemed to understand Claire in ways that John no longer could. Their conversations were filled with an easy intimacy, and Mark's attentiveness to Claire's needs and desires made her feel valued and important. She found herself looking forward to their interactions more than she ever thought possible. The flattery of being seen, truly seen, had become an addictive drug, and she couldn't resist it. John, on the other hand, remained oblivious. His work consumed him completely. Long hours at the office left him too tired to notice the growing distance between him and Claire. He believed everything was fine, that their marriage, despite the occasional tension, was strong. He had always trusted his wife, assuming that the bond they shared was unbreakable. But as time went on, Claire grew more distant. She would spend hours on the phone in the other room, her conversations muffled but with a tone she had never used when speaking to John. She became more secretive, her phone always out of view, and the smile she gave John seemed forced, almost as if it were a mask she wore to hide her growing dissatisfaction. Mark's role at the company also became more prominent. John, ever the supportive boss, saw Mark's success as a reflection of his own leadership and took pride in his work. He frequently spoke of Mark's capabilities, even suggesting him for promotions and recommending him for high-profile projects. To John, Mark was a loyal employee, a rising star in the company, someone he could rely on. But unbeknownst to him, Mark was steadily becoming more involved in his personal life in ways that would soon have devastating consequences. Claire and Mark's affair, though still hidden, had become an open secret in the office. They shared lingering glances during meetings, private conversations during company outings, and moments that were charged with an undeniable tension. Their connection had shifted from mere friendship to something far more complicated and dangerous. Claire felt an exhilaration she hadn't experienced in years, the excitement of sneaking around, the thrill of doing something forbidden. Mark, too, seemed to relish the secrecy, enjoying the power he had over Claire. He promised her a future, a life they could build together once the inevitable happened. Claire clung to that promise, even as a gnawing feeling of guilt began to creep into her mind. The growing intimacy between them didn't go unnoticed. Emily, though she tried to push aside her concerns, began to see small signs of her mother's emotional detachment. Claire's usual warmth and attention were now replaced by a coldness, a distance that left Emily feeling unsure of where she stood in her mother's life. The family dinners, once filled with lively conversation and laughter, became silent affairs. John's focus was always on work, and Claire's mind seemed to wander, her eyes avoiding her husband's gaze as if she were lost in thoughts of something or someone else. Claire's behavior became erratic, her moods fluctuating wildly. One moment, she would be calm and composed. The next, she would be irritable and distant. She began to show little interest in the things she used to enjoy, preferring to stay isolated in her room or take long, unannounced walks. Emily noticed these changes, but her suspicions were dismissed as mere teenage angst. What Emily didn't know, however, was that her mother's emotional withdrawal was the result of a deep internal conflict. Claire was torn between the man she had once loved and the man who now consumed her thoughts and desires. Mark continued to be a shadow in their lives, present in Claire's thoughts, even when he wasn't physically there. Their meetings, though brief, were charged with an undeniable chemistry, a chemistry that only deepened the more time they spent together. They discussed the future, their plans, and the life they would one day have. If only they could get rid of John. It was during these conversations that the idea, initially unspoken, began to take form. Claire could be free, truly free, if John were out of the picture. It was a dangerous thought, one that would eventually lead Claire down a dark and irreversible path. The day John Simmons was found dead was one that would forever change the lives of his family. The news hit Emily like a freight train, leaving her in a daze as the details began to unfold. It was an ordinary evening when it happened. John had come home from work earlier than usual, appearing unusually tired but otherwise normal. He had sat down to dinner, barely managing to engage in conversation with the family, before excusing himself to retire early. It was the first time in months that John had expressed fatigue so deeply. His face was pale, his movements slow and labored. He had seemed off, but no one thought much of it at the time. They all assumed it was just stress from work, or maybe a minor illness. The next morning, John was found collapsed in his bedroom by Claire, who frantically called for help. Paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. John Simmons, the strong and successful businessman, was gone. The doctors initially declared it a sudden heart attack, something that seemed plausible given his long hours at the office and the stress that had been building up in his life. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death as cardiac arrest, and that was the end of the matter. No one thought to dig deeper. It seemed like a tragic but natural occurrence. John's heart had simply given out. However, Emily couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. As much as she wanted to grieve and move on, a sense of unease lingered within her. The suddenness of her father's death didn't sit right. There had been no signs of health issues before that night. John had always been in decent shape, his doctor visits were routine, and he had no known history of heart disease. But now, after his death, Claire's behavior was something Emily couldn't ignore. Her mother had acted strangely calm in the days following John's passing. She was the picture of the grieving widow, attending to funeral arrangements with a level of composure that seemed unnatural. It wasn't that Claire didn't care. Emily knew her mother loved her father, but her demeanor was almost too controlled. There was no outward breakdown, no desperate cries for help, just an eerie quiet that surrounded her. Emily observed it closely. Claire had kept herself busy with guests, phone calls, and funeral plans, but behind her seemingly busy facade, there was something unsettlingly calm about her. She didn't show the same pain that Emily had expected from her mother. She didn't break down in tears or retreat into her grief. Instead, she seemed focused, almost as if her mind were elsewhere. Emily tried to reach out to her mother, to talk about the loss of her father, but Claire wasn't receptive. It was as if a wall had gone up between them. Claire's interactions with Emily became more distant. The warmth that had once characterized their relationship seemed to evaporate, replaced by a cold formality that Emily couldn't explain. It was clear that her mother was hiding something, and the more Emily thought about it, the more she became convinced that John's death wasn't as simple as the doctors had concluded. In the weeks following the funeral, Emily took it upon herself to go through her father's things. She didn't expect to find anything incriminating, but there was a part of her that needed answers, that needed to know why her father had died so suddenly. While going through John's personal files, Emily stumbled upon a series of emails, messages between her mother and someone she didn't recognize. As she read through them, her heart sank. The emails were casual at first, discussing work events and personal matters, but as she continued, the tone of the messages shifted. There was a sense of intimacy that left Emily feeling sick to her stomach. Her mother had been having an affair, And not just with anyone. Mark, the manager at John's company. The realization hit Emily hard. She had suspected something was off, but seeing it in black and white was another thing entirely. The emails were filled with secretive language, hints of their meetings, and expressions of affection that no wife should have for another man. Emily's mind raced. How long had this affair been going on? Was it possible that her father's death had been something more than just a heart attack? Could her mother have been involved in something far darker than she ever imagined? As Emily pieced together the timeline, she began to realize just how much she didn't know about her family. Her mother, the woman she had trusted her whole life, had been leading a double life. The betrayal was more than she could bear. But what struck her the hardest was the possibility that her mother might have been involved in her father's death. The thought was unfathomable, but the evidence was clear. Something about John's sudden death didn't make sense, and Emily was determined to find out the truth, no matter where it led. As Emily delved deeper into the web of secrets her mother had kept hidden, she couldn't help but feel the weight of betrayal crushing her. The emails between Claire and Mark were just the beginning. The more Emily uncovered, the more she realized that her father's death had not been a simple tragedy, but a calculated event. Claire's affair with Mark, once a hidden part of her life, now appeared to be the key to understanding the dark truth behind John's sudden passing. The final blow came when Emily discovered an email that seemed harmless at first, but as she read it more carefully, its significance became chilling. It was a message from Mark to Claire, discussing John's life insurance policy. Mark had referred to it in passing, noting that it would be a lucrative payout once John was no longer around. At first, Emily thought it was just a casual comment, but then the pieces fell into place. The way Mark had spoken about the insurance policy, the way he had implied that John's death would benefit Claire, it all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Claire and Mark had planned John's death. Emily's mind raced. Could it be true? Could her mother, the woman she had looked up to all her life, have been involved in such a horrific plot? The idea was almost too much to bear. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the signs had always been there. The suddenness of John's death, the lack of grief from Claire, the way she had been acting distant and cold, everything pointed to something darker than a natural death. With trembling hands, Emily decided to take her findings to the police. She couldn't sit on this knowledge any longer. It was too much for her to carry alone, and the truth needed to come to light. She wasn't sure how the authorities would react, but she knew she had to try. After all, if she didn't, the truth would stay buried, and her father's death would remain an unsolved mystery. The police were skeptical at first. After all, John's death had been ruled a natural cause, and there was no obvious evidence to suggest foul play. But as Emily shared the emails and the details of the life insurance policy, the officers began to take her seriously. They agreed to reopen the investigation, but the task before them was not an easy one. The evidence was circumstantial at best, and the case would require a deep dive into Claire and Mark's relationship, as well as a thorough examination of John's health records and the life insurance policy. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. The life insurance policy, which had been taken out just months before John's death, was surprisingly large. The timing was suspicious, especially considering that John had never shown any signs of serious health problems. Additionally, the police discovered that Claire had been in constant contact with Mark during the weeks leading up to John's death. It was clear that their relationship had gone beyond that of a mere affair. They had been planning something, together, and that something involved John's untimely demise. As the investigation deepened, the authorities began to focus on Claire. They uncovered financial records that showed Claire had been withdrawing large sums of money from their joint accounts shortly after John's death, and Mark had been seen visiting her home on several occasions in the days leading up to the funeral. The police were now convinced that Claire's involvement went far beyond infidelity. It seemed as though she had been the mastermind behind her husband's murder, with Mark as her willing accomplice. Emily was horrified by what she was learning, but a part of her still held on to the hope that she was wrong. She wanted to believe that her mother had been a victim of circumstances, that she had acted out of desperation or some other misguided sense of love. But the evidence was undeniable. Claire's betrayal of her husband had been far more than just an affair. It had been a calculated attempt to remove him from their lives, and Emily had been blind to it for far too long. In the end, the truth came crashing down with a weight that Emily could hardly comprehend. Her mother, the woman who had always seemed so loving and protective, had been involved in the death of her father. The betrayal was complete, and the pain it caused Emily was more than she could bear. The once perfect family was shattered, and the life they had known was forever altered. As the investigation moved forward, Claire's carefully constructed life began to unravel in front of her. The walls that she had built around herself to protect her secret were quickly crumbling, and her world, once filled with control and manipulation, was falling apart. Emily watched from a distance as her mother became a suspect in the murder of her father. The woman who had raised her, who had always been the picture of grace and strength, was now the prime focus of a criminal investigation. The authorities began to piece together the final moments leading to John's death. They discovered that Claire and Mark had not only been planning the murder for months, but had also taken deliberate steps to ensure that John's death would look natural. Claire had been administering small doses of poison to her husband, disguised as medication for his supposed heart condition. The poison had been slow-acting, which is why John hadn't shown any immediate signs of distress. But over time it took its toll on his body, weakening him until that fateful night when his heart finally gave out. The life insurance policy, which Claire and Mark had carefully orchestrated, was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the motive that tied everything together. Claire was arrested in the middle of the night, her face pale and hollow as she was led out of her home in handcuffs. Emily couldn't bring herself to watch the scene unfold. She had always believed that her mother was incapable of such darkness, but now she saw the cold, hard reality. Claire had planned her father's death with Mark for months, driven by greed, infidelity, and a desire to start a new life without the burden of John. The trial that followed was long and painful. Emily had to sit through every moment, listening as the prosecutors laid out the damning evidence against her mother. The emails, the financial records, the testimonies from those who had witnessed Claire and Mark's behavior